Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to today's discussion on Africa Asia. So today, what we are looking at, and as you've seen from maybe the invite that we sent out, is on China, Africa aid, and some contemporary issues around that. But Patricia will go a bit more in detail on the topic. And she's our panelist. She'll be speaking about this tonight. And Patricia, it's very nice to have you, as always.
Yeah.
And you can introduce yourself and then just carry on with making the presentation. And we are projecting the presentation for anyone who wants to follow the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's always a pleasure to be here and to share my knowledge about the subject. My name is Natalie Patricia Chiremiral. Yes, I'm a student of China-Africa affairs, legal affairs, and I've been interested in the subject for about 3 years. I studied in China for my master's degree, and this is where I picked up my interest, and I share my ideas and my insights here on the Africa Asia platform. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Christine.
Okay. Patricia, we can just go straight on for you to possibly give a recap, maybe a short recap of the last discussion that we had, because this is the second part. Even if we have the discussion on YouTube and on podcast that anyone can listen to. But if you can give a quick recap and join it together with today's topic and then just carry on with the discussion.
Yes, so last 2 weeks back, the first portion of this topic, we had an introduction of some of the issues that concern, and like a background of China's engagement with Africa in the field of security, aid, and cooperation. So what is very interesting about this topic for me was the fact that China is, as it builds its presence globally as a large economic actor, it's backing up this position with participating as a security contributor. And as we discussed last week, this correlates with its relationship with Africa, because China is living up to being a major economic partner with Africa. It's increasing its assets, its interests in Africa, on the African continent, and it has a number of Chinese citizens who are moving to Africa in different African countries to work in these Chinese companies. So it has a lot to lose and a lot to gain from building a security presence in Africa. So as we discussed, there are a number of ways China is engaging in the security sector in Africa, either through international avenues with the UN Security Council, peacekeeping missions, or engaging directly with African countries through direct bilateral aid and security and aid and cooperation, either by providing logistics like arms or training, military training to African countries, or equipment or finance military activity. And it's also personally building its own military presence. It already has an offshore military basis in Djibouti, and it's increasing, private security to guard its own its own companies. So there are a lot of risks on the African continent that it needs to protect its assets from. So there's civil strife, there's strikes, there are all sorts of, dangers, terrorism. So it's building a security presence slowly, and this needs to be an issue for African governments in order to establish legal frameworks and to establish an engagement, an equal engagement, in order to make sure that it's not just China that's making the rules about what kind of security they provide, and also to look at the consequences of this increasing security presence on the African continent. So that's a brief background to the topic.
Okay, yeah, and I think, Patricia, you've captured it quite well, especially like the background, where China is coming from, what's driving them, especially their business,
Yes.
and how much property that they now own in Africa. And that has been, you can see how the relationship has evolved from the first time, when you spoke about the ideologies that brought Africa and China together, to now China investing into Africa and now needing to protect its assets and to protect its citizens.
Exactly.
And so that's quite a good background of what we covered last time. So for this week, tell us a bit more about like the issues on China-Africa Security Aid Cooperation. Yeah.
So I think first I want to talk about security aid and cooperation with Africa, Chinese security aid and cooperation with Africa, in two major aspects. That's the role of foreign trade and investment in conflict, and the second aspect is war and conflict as a tool of power. So in the first aspect, I would like to talk about the role of foreign trade and investment in conflict, especially on the African continent. So trade plays a major role in conflicts in Africa. China is fast becoming Africa's largest foreign trading partner, and its trade in minerals and in the extractive industry has increased exponentially. And we all know that minerals have played a large part in escalation of conflict in many mineral-rich countries in Africa, which poses that conundrum of how can Africa be so wealthy but be so poor, and to have so much, disparity and poverty and on such a wealthy continent. And this is mainly because of these conflict minerals, especially the 3 TGs, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, as well as coltan and diamonds. These have been the major causes of conflict in some of the wealthiest mineral-rich countries on the African continent, which are Sierra Leone, DRC, and Angola. So we see that international organizations and researchers have discovered that there's a correlation between illicit international trade in these conflict minerals and armed conflict, because rebels, warlords finance themselves through the illicit sale of these minerals. And what is even more surprising is that foreign countries are major financiers behind the illicit trade of these minerals, which brings about so much conflict, so much discordance, so much poverty, and slows down development on the African continent. So we see that trade is essentially a self-interest, is about self-interest and profit. So countries enter mineral mining or extractive industry, agreements for the benefit, for their own personal gain, for their own self-interest. So engaging in discussions about controlling and regulating this, this wealth which will benefit them, is very, very difficult for them to tie themselves to these obligations. But however, they are becoming, globalization and the increase of, eyes and criticism and civil society, most of these states are binding themselves to treaties that put on them responsibility to have sustainability and good governance standards in their trade relations. So I've given an example of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, OCD guidelines, and even the United States has a specific law, the US Dodd-Frank Act, that regulates import and use of these materials, so these minerals. So companies are required to have due diligence on where they get their minerals from, and to have sort of like a supply chain, like background from where they get these minerals, so that they can have accountability for how their minerals are sourced, so that you can see that it does not involve conflicts. They're not made or extracted from areas that are prevalent with conflict, or use child soldiers or child labor or things like that. So China, as a global partner and as a consumer of Africa's main consumer of these minerals, which participate in the escalation of conflict on the African continent, needs to have an effective supply chain due diligence. So that is how trade plays a role in this. And China, of course, has had to respond to their own, responsibility, international responsibility, especially as a participant of the UN Security Council. So when the UN Security Council, for example, in the DRC, passed a resolution to place an embargo on the sale of arms in the DRC because there was so much conflict related to conflict minerals, it had an expert team investigate this conflict and found that a lot of the export of weapons was financed by companies from so many other countries, but including China. So China was also relevant in supporting the embargo. However, I think last year, when the Chinese foreign delegation visited DRC, they engaged in talks on lifting this same embargo. Yet the DRC still has not yet met the requirements of, ensuring that conflict minerals are there's proper regulation of these conflict minerals. And also it has ascended to the Arms Trade Treaty, which it did so on the October 2020 last year. So this treaty is basically to regulate sale of arms, especially small arms and light weapons. And the principle, of course, it reiterates the principles we discussed last week of non-interference, determination of peace and security, and all those good principles it lives up to in saying that it's partnering with African countries or the global mechanism for ensuring security and peace on the African continent. So in that way, China is kind of living up to its role. It's kind of answering, but of course there are salient issues. You can question whether it says one thing at the front and then does another thing at the back, especially with the DRC Congo. So you need to have that kind of commitment from them, the side of commitment, which is also the same thing you can say for investment, Chinese investment in security, aid and cooperation, financing of militant groups or militant mineral conflict states in Africa, militant governments in Africa does not positively contribute to development in these countries. it may be used as a positive tool for constructive economic transformation, but it can also have negative impacts, especially where the foundation of governance is poor, there's corruption, there's prevalence of corruption, and it exacerbates the underlying issues. So by giving money to these governments who are, using these weapons and these security tools as a weapon or as a tool to oppress their own citizens and to keep public order in quotes, it does not contribute to human security, which is for humans, for African citizens to live free of fear or to live free of circumstances that intervene with their proper enjoyment of human rights. So that is how I can introduce the first aspect, the role of trade and investment in conflict in Africa, and how Chinese cooperation and aid contributes to that.
The previous slide where you highlighted about China signing the UN Security Council and having to do like a due diligence, just like the US, on like where some of the minerals are sourced from. Yes. I mean, I think that's a move in the positive direction on the part of China, especially because you see that, like blood diamonds, trading in them, like if you're buying diamonds, there's a strict requirement to like look on where they've been sourced, so that countries like Sierra Leone or, like countries which diamond was used to fund wars, like there's a market which will not buy such diamond. But for China, I think, I don't know, the situation with China has been I think they've been a bit more lenient, so that we have been able to like keep on trading in such things, which African countries are happy about, because you see, especially for countries where like the value of their diamonds is not so valuable because of like their blood diamonds, their value is very, very low, if at all, because they're in the black market. But then when you find someone who can trade in them like China, there has been benefits from that. So there's the two sides where African countries are feeling at what point should our diamonds and minerals be recognized as legit despite what they are funding. But then also at the same time, I think even from our discussion last week, that's what we were saying. Sometimes giving more and more money and supporting and investing, just as you have noted, might have a negative impact and perpetuate the wars and perpetuate the situation that actually is. Yeah, so I think these are very good comments. And even on this trade in arms deal though, and what China and DRC now have gone to discuss on the side, again, it's something, maybe, I don't know what principles underline China's, because there's an agreement that you've signed. So is it what they consider to be friendship to go against a treaty that you've signed? Or it's unclear why they signed the treaty, then at the same time go do something else. Maybe it will be on the principle that we are friends with an African country. But then also treaties have meaning. That's why there's international law of treaties. That's how the treaties work. But I think those are some comments that I had from what you made. But yeah, this is quite an interesting discussion. Personally, I'm really enjoying it.
Yes, actually, I think the discussion with DRC Congo and China, I don't know how I forgot to put the link for where I read the story from, but it's on a website called the China Africa Project. So you can go and read the actual story there, and there's a couple of reasons, Chinese interest reasons behind that discussion, something China will gain in exchange for this, because the DRC at that time was one of the latest countries to enter into the Belt and Road Initiative, and was signing on to like an agreement with China to increase some of more mining rights in the DRC, and also at the time the DRC had also entered into had re-entered into the AGOA agreement, trade agreement. So China could start to benefit from that agreement. So it's all like up there, like China benefits from something and then gives back something. So you see where it's going. It's kind of like a self-interest sort of thing. Like you do not consider the security implications of handing back this kind of power to militant groups by lifting such an embargo and unfreezing assets of these warlords. So you just gaining something from it, but you do not see the consequences in return. Like you don't even know the terms of what they agreed to at this meeting. So I think there's a lot of backdoor, and it doesn't bode well for the people of DRC, I think. Anyway, I think we can move on to the topic of war and conflict as a tool of power. So, of course, like we discussed before, there is some, a kind of like a correlation between China's participation as a security actor in Africa. There are kind of like relations. It also introduces another angle of relations as a growing partner in global relations. So there is kind of like a tug of war, a power dynamic between the US and other prominent traditional, partners with Africa. So by increasing its own presence in Africa, it kind of like increases its influence with African countries. So by supplying more arms, by financing, it increases its own power dynamics and power and geopolitical relations with African countries. Like we discussed before, China has a security aid and cooperation background with African countries, and this background has solidified power of many governments, previous governments in African countries. So it's just moving up from there, and some of the global issues that are happening with China as a global power are tied to to its power struggle with the US and its uprising presence in international affairs. So you can see this, the case can be seen. I cited how Rwanda and Uganda used their power as intervening countries in the DRC to exploit mineral resources in the DRC. So it can bring in that, that aspect where you have another country in the guise of offering aid is in turn exploiting that same country. So China needs to be a bit more transparent and a bit more clear about its own position, where it stands with providing aid and security or financing conflict countries in African countries, and not to increase on the problems that are already there. So it needs to have a clear framework and a clear foreign policy on where it stands. Otherwise, its intentions will be misinterpreted or can be used as a tool for exploiting these vulnerable countries and situations. And then, of course, you can see, as we talked before, about the digitalization of security and weapon technology. So by China providing these African countries with technology, surveillance technology, with digitalizing law enforcement. So you see that it's increasing its own private security, private public-private SOEs in African countries like ZTE and Huawei, which are increasing, providing digital assets and providing digital surveillance, advanced surveillance technology, which can be used to, enforce and democratic practices in African countries, and can be used as a tool for abusing human rights, spying on citizens, or, just using technology in a way that is not for the good of security or law enforcement. So it might be used as a way of empowering law enforcement, but it also has the potential of being applied negatively. So China needs the proper legal frameworks, the proper agreements with these governments, and to be able to use its technology in ways that are bringing about positive and not negative means. And this can also be said for African governments. Most of our African governments do not even have the legal frameworks to regulate this kind of technology. We do not know what it does. We do not produce, we do not manufacture it or assemble it in our own countries. We just use the end product. It can be used as a tool for spying on these governments. There was a rumor that the technology that was put in the AU building that the Chinese built for the African Union was used for spying for China until I think 2017, when they caught it, and then they replaced the technology in the building, the entire building. So they were seeing this flow of data at night from the building to China. So they tracked it to China. So it can be used in that way. So we need to have a way of tracking and having power in this technology transfer, or in this use of this technology in ways that can allow African governments to do security checks, to do due diligence on where these things are produced and how they are applied, and what kind of rules they are applied to before we actually implement it and use it. It is a tool that another government can use to influence negatively our own decisions. So we as African people, as lawmakers, as civil society, we need to be able to talk about this and to get our governments to pay attention to it.
Especially from 2020, when a lot of things were being done online. And to be fair, it's not just China. Well, maybe China and the US also, like they can spy and listen to you on the technology. But like someone once noted, most of even the court, the judiciaries within Africa, there was no indigenous or online platforms through which even such an authority, it's the judiciary of a country. They were still using technology that was not hosted in the country, and even that was being provided by someone who is not, who is either the US or China, or mainly those two. And you see, that's the danger which you're saying, especially such critical information. And when you think about it, some of the things that will be decided by the courts, sometimes they have an influence even on Chinese companies or even US companies, UK companies, and such things. So when the judiciary is using these systems, what guarantee of protection of even the data or even the conversations that are being had, that there will be there? But I think it's a big concern, and especially when you say for most African countries, they may not even have laws, or even if they are not comprehensive enough about cyber security. Even if there's the Africa Union Convention, which has not been last I checked, and we had a discussion about this, not even 15 African countries had signed onto it. So it didn't get enough signatories, the Convention on Cyber Security. But yeah, I think that's a good point, especially it's a big thing right now, since even the COVID situation where there is use of digital platforms by across many governments, for even government purposes. It's quite something serious to consider. And we will not even go into how serious it is to give military equipment, technology equipment to African countries, and they're just using them. And China, in and of itself, like, has its own systems even within China where they can track even their own citizens and like get information about someone. Why do we think that cannot be used in Africa in a military base? It's quite a lot of considerations for that. I agree.
Yes, definitely. We can see that, of course, China does have a lot to gain from being a security actor in Africa. It, like how we have been discussing, it has a lot at stake in Africa. It has assets, it has citizens it needs to protect in Africa so it can build its security presence, but also as part of its own, economic growth principles or strategies, it's looking to reform its manufacturing industry and increase productivity of its goods and to expand its global presence. So it's building all these connections, all these linkages, these chains globally, and it needs to reinforce these linkages and these connections. So as a security actor in Africa, it needs to protect these assets and its own political presence as a rule maker on what security decisions are made and how they will impact it as a country. And of course, it has said that it contributes because it's rising. It needs, a peaceful rise as a global power and also to facilitate peaceful development, because where there is war, there is no development, which is, it's true. So if you have development, then of course you have peace. You have peace in these places. You will be able to have a baseline from which to develop. You have stability. You have consistency. You can be able to, predict the situation, and you can protect your assets, and you can be able to be ascertained that nothing will change, and you will be able to get returns from your investments. So it needs to reinforce its ties, to be friendly towards these African governments where it's investing, but also to make sure that its own assets are protected in order to meet its own goals, its own development goals. And on the other hand, Africa also does have something to gain. Where it has peace and security, it can have development, economic transformation, it can have delivery of public goods to these areas that have been, war ravaged, and it can be able to have an enabling environment for constructive foreign investment. So it can be able to make sure that its own people heal and it moves on, and these countries can develop, and also bolstering its military capacity can help protect its own territorial integrity and sovereignty, which we can see for most African countries that are bordering countries where there is one conflict. We see that's why Uganda participates in the Sudan or Somalia, and why Kenya also participates in its own in Somalia and the Somalia conflict, because it needs to protect itself from terrorism. So it needs to bolster its own military capacity to protect its people and its territorial, integrity. And to do that, it needs outside help. So there's something to gain. And also it needs to diversify its partners. So it cannot be dependent on just the US or just Russia. That way it will have flexibility in deciding its own decision making, and it won't be tied to one source of military cooperation, whereby it will be required to meet the conditions of that one country. So Africa does have something to gain. But on the other hand, we have discussed some of the drawbacks, which include sustaining power of regimes that support the Chinese ideology and policies as China, increases its presence, and the acquisition of aid and finance without conditionality to be accountable for the adverse impact of the funded projects on security and peace in African states. So that is something that African countries definitely do not gain positively. There are negative consequences for that, and many more which we have discussed before. And we did talk about who is driving the initiative. So ideally, we would say that it's a balancing act. It's a cooperation. Both parties have something they are bringing to the table. China is saying that it's for mutual benefit, it's for equality, it's respect, sovereignty, protection, non-interference, having African countries be independent. But still, the other component is that China is providing and taking more than African countries are gaining from this relationship. And we are looking at it in the term of that China, as it gains power, is almost eclipsing the US as Africa's big brother. The person who tells you do this or do that, or this won't be good, or I can always, support you where I can, but in other places I really can't. My hands are tied. Like in ways where you become reliant on aid from China because it has less conditions, and a relationship where it's unbalanced. The person is much more powerful over you, and you're required to give allegiance because you feel like as if this person is giving you so much and you have to pay back in some way. But in the end, you're not gaining from it positively. The consequences are not, there are consequences there. So in that way, you have to look at this relationship in a way that you have to see the gaps. You have to see that China's policy, even if the rules are there, it will say that the rules are there, but they're not comprehensive. They are not as nuanced as it would say, and they allow too much flexibility on China's side. They do not allow commitment, and they allow China to go back on its, either to be a quiet observer and not act, and only act when it can benefit and not see the true picture. So by having a flexible policy, it gives itself a back door, a way out, a way of, jumping ship and turning and having self-interest. So in those gaps, African countries need to fill in on the other end, to contribute something to balance it out, to use their own assets as leverage in this relationship, and to realize that there are gaps and there will be situations in which China will choose self-interest over your own interests because it has a lot to gain and a lot to protect. So we need to balance out that relationship.
What happens at FOCAC is those action points are just action points. They're not, it's unlike when, for instance, the UK enters into an economic partnership agreement with Kenya, for instance, or when US has an FTA with Morocco, or there's almost like a legal basis that's clear. FOCAC, on the other hand, like just as you're speaking about, there's a lot of flexibility on China's side, and there's no commitment. And how you show commitment is just actually having a comprehensive agreement that you can go back to and say, we don't call it a commitment because they call it's a cooperation. It's something that's very fluid, But
Yes,
we can't
exactly.
go back to our clause in the partnership agreement and say we agreed to negotiate an investment deal, or this is how we are cooperating on, let's say, even customs clearance if it's like an FTA. With China,
Yes,
you don't know where you stand, and it's an action plan which can change today or tomorrow. It's very fluid. There's nothing you can
there's
go
no
back and tell them.
implementation. Yeah.
There's no implementation. Even if I would think China, for their side, they are like, they'll save their face, they not do these things and just not implement them. But I think it's that lack of a solid basis we can all work from. That's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah. That is always the problem. There's no way of providing accountability and responsibility for what has happened. Because that's what solid agreements, signed solid agreements, act as law, as binding tools for governments to bind themselves, to be accountable and to have responsibility. It's the only kind of law that really actually matters, because there's consequence for your actions. And China needs to see those consequences. It's not just about saying that yeah, we provide finance and it will bring development, but you need to accept responsibility for the negative impacts of providing that kind of finance, because that kind of finance leads to certain negative consequences, and those negative consequences have impact on your standing as an actor, as a responsible partner. So you need to have a framework in which you can have responsibility and accountability, and have a way in which you can properly say, I did what I could as your friend, as your partner. These are the laws I've put in place, and I hold my companies to these laws. I can prosecute them this way by, these kind of agreements. And also, of course, it's not just up to China, it's also up to African countries. So African countries also need to wake up to that reality that China is not going to write the laws for you, and it should not write the laws. You need to write the rules yourself, and you need to put them on the table as a negotiating tool, that if you're providing this kind of aid and security, it will have these kinds of repercussions or consequences. The minerals have these kinds of, regulations that you have to follow and you have to track. That is the kind of meaningful, cooperation, conversation we need to have with China, being responsible for these kinds of things, these meaningful things, these impactful things, not the on top, yeah, we're giving you money to help you with development. And no, that is just the surface. That doesn't carry to the grassroots why it matters. When you start talking about, due diligence, sustainability, and accountability for actions of companies or your trade and investment at that level, then it makes much, much more meaningful cooperation. So that is kind of like the gist of my observations. So, and that will be it for my discussion. Of course, the presentation will be available for review and to look over for anyone who's available. But that is what my ideas on the topic are. Thank you, Christine.